We're now going to look at deliverance theology in the New Testament. When the New Testament speaks of sin, it does not remind us of the fall, but it is always assumed in the discussion. Genesis 3 gives us an account of the fall of humanity. In this story, God revealed his will to Adam and Eve. However, under the influence of Satan, they consciously disobeyed the law of God, which God gave them for their good. So the Genesis 3 account shows us that sin is much like disobedience and defiance. So human beings who were created in the image of God have fallen from that primitive image and are separated from God. Because of the disobedience of Adam and Eve, humans are depraved in their nature. The Old Testament shows us this, but it is the New Testament which develops the full theological implications of this idea. Paul is the one who gives us three implications of original sin. First, there is the theological sense. In Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 32, he gives us the theological meaning of original sin. A creature of God, humans refuse to honor God as God. They chose voluntarily to worship the creature rather than the Creator. Their foolish hearts were darkened. In Romans chapter 5, verses 12 to 21, Paul gives us the historical sense of original sin. Because of the solidarity of the human race, each person is involved in sin. But because of Adam's disobedience, the whole race died in sin. We were born in a race which is distant from God and died in sin. However, the obedience of Christ was an act of divine grace that makes life possible and makes holiness possible as well. By faith, we are incorporated into Christ and we inherit the grace, and that grace expels sin. Also, there is the existential sense. In Romans chapter 7, verses 14 to 25, Paul gives us the existential sense of original sin. In verses 14 and 18, the apostle uses the term flesh or sarx to speak of, he uses that, sometimes Paul will use that to speak of the physical body, but then sometimes he will use that same word in reference to the fragility or the weakness of human beings. But in this particular passage in Romans chapter 7, he is using it here in its most distinctive and religious sense. It's not an allusion here to the human body or to the fragility of humanity. However, it makes reference to the existence in which human beings turn to themselves. The flesh is me. The flesh is, I am living my life for myself, so that human beings have a perverse fondness. It can probably be used of the sense of egocentricity as well. Jesus also agrees with the idea of sin as a corruption of humanity. See Matthew chapter 15, verses 19 to 20. Jesus said in John chapter 3, verse 6, that which is born of flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. And in that same context, Jesus insisted on a new birth. Paul said in one place, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. What Paul meant there, of course, is that those who are living for themselves, who are living out of this self-centered existence, cannot please God. That such a human being is only free to sin. And so Paul, in this particular passage, chapter 7, verses 15 and 19, says, "For I do not know what I do. Let's turn to that passage. Romans chapter 7, verses 15 and 19. Romans chapter 7, verse 15. "For I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate." Then verse 19. "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing." And then in verse 24 of the same chapter, he says, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" So here we find a very bleak description of the state or nature of humanity, and it then sets the stage for Christ, the deliverer. We have seen that the normal pattern of redemption revealed in the Old Testament is Exodus. The Old Testament writers waited for the great day of redemption, an eschatological, a new Exodus. The New Testament writers retained oftentimes the images of the Exodus. However, they declared that the work and ministry of Jesus was prophesied by, or foretold by the prophets, had entered into history. This resulted in the creation of a new Israel in the same way as the first Exodus created an ancient Israel. Jesus saw his ministry had redemptive significance. In Mark chapter 10, verse 45, he says there, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." In the discourse during the Lord's Supper, Jesus gives the most extended identification of his role as the servant of the Lord. In both the setting and the words of Jesus, Jesus addresses his own imminent return and his own imminent death, rather, and his role as the Passover lamb of Exodus. Note that this is not the sacrificial, not the lamb of the sacrificial system of Israel's worship, but the Passover lamb of Exodus. So both Jesus and the Passover lamb were slaughtered as the symbol of redemption of a covenant people. Both indicate the culmination of a conflict between God and the powers of evil, these being defeated by the power of God. Like the plagues of Egypt, the death and resurrection of Jesus were a climactic encounter with the power of evil. See Colossians chapter 2, verse 15, and Ephesians 4:8. One big difference between the two paradigms is that the cross, God's power, was demonstrated in the midst of supposed weakness. At the time of his sufferings, the servant of the Lord was the power of God demonstrated in the most powerful form. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 20. We'll begin reading verse 20. It says there, "Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach, to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." So God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. So here we find that the servant of the Lord demonstrate his power, and he does so in weakness. We can see a transformation of the concept of the power of the Holy Spirit. Here, the power of the Holy Spirit is not power to conquer, but power to suffer. And this is a concept that I think we need to reflect on more and more. And I think, for example, Peter, when Peter goes into the garden, in the Garden of Gethsemane, as the soldiers came to attack Jesus, Peter whipped out his sword and cut off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest, or the priest. And Jesus tells him to put away his sword. Here, I think we see an example of what I'm trying to say here, and that is that we need to fully understand who Jesus is. Jesus defines life in the Spirit, and so many times I think the power of the Spirit is misconstrued as a power to conquer rather than as a power to suffer. The next subject that we want to look at is the church as the new Israel. The most dominant theme in the New Testament, though it is not stated as such, is the church as the new Israel. There is a continuity and a discontinuity with ancient Israel. In 1 Peter chapter 2, we see some of that taking place. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, it says there, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. See also Romans 9, verses 25 to 29. In Isaiah chapters 56 to chapters 66, the prophet made a difference between the true and the false Israel. Both were called into existence by God, but ancient Israel was oriented toward national life. However, the new Israel, it has no nationalistic dimensions, and the continuity between the two is through the Holy Spirit. During the history of God's people, we can see the change in the composition of his people. In the beginning, the nation of Israel represented the people of God. But the prophets of the exile proclaimed that a remnant of the nation will return. In the end, the hope grew that one man will be the representative of the nation. In the Old Testament, the idea is limited to one man. However, the idea in the New Testament widens to include the people who identify with Christ. And here we see, as stated previously, we see Israel represented the people of God, and then there came this narrowing of the concept to the idea that the remnant represented the people of God. Finally narrowed to one point, as we saw earlier from Isaiah chapter 53, that the hope of the people rested in one man who would represent the people. And of course, as Christians, we know that one man to be Christ, or Jesus. And now in the New Testament, there comes this widening of the concept of the people of God, so that it includes the church. So in Romans chapter 11, well, you can see that continuity as indicated by Paul in his allegory of the olive tree. The olive tree is the same olive tree. However, grafting has gone on, a surgery, so to speak, has gone on to graft in several branches into the olive tree. So one can see in this both continuity and discontinuity. There are not two peoples of God. There is one people of God. And the continuity between the old people and the church is theologically prior to its origin in the promise of God to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. So another word for the church in the New Testament is ecclesia. The word ecclesia is the word used most frequently in the New Testament for the church. It means those who are called out of. So the Greek word was used for local assembly of citizens that were called out for a specific purpose. So it is the idea that the nation of Israel was called to a global mission so that everyone can know God's salvation. And the church has a responsibility in continuing that mission, the mission of God's people. And So we are called into existence by God to share in this redemptive mission within the world. And now, redemption ethics. Although creation ethics applied to everyone, the ethics of deliverance or redemption ethics applies to people who are recipients of God's grace. The logic behind the Ten Commandments is this: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt from the house of bondage. And on the basis of that, then God makes certain demands or gives the Ten Commandments. It's these redemption ethics then are reserved for God's people. The Pharisees of Jesus' day took care to observe the law, but Jesus said to them, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Matthew chapter 5, verse 20. So the new ethics or redemption ethics places a new emphasis on the righteousness of the heart. For example, the law condemned killing, but Jesus condemned anger. The ethics of Jesus and the apostles moves beyond the ethics of the Pharisees and the legalistic requirements of the Pharisees, and it focuses on the internal character, that is, the basis of behavior. Because of this, the commandment of God is the first command of Jesus. So there, in Jesus' words, he gives us a summary of the commandments in Matthew chapter 22, verse 34. He says, verse 37, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So we have come now to a conclusion of creation ethics in the New Testament.